But when we use the linguistic term to discuss the truth of us, of Asia, of course we should question ourselves always that Asia should be a method, a way to go out, or just simply a trip of pan-nationalism. So, however, I believe when we try to achieve some cooperation projects within the regions, the concept of Asia already exists by our everyday practices of curation. Ancient Asia's platform sounds kind of new terms, but in fact we could trace it back to the late 19th century when the founder of the University of Tokyo's Okakura Tenshin made Tagalog in Bengal's regions. However, it's also really new terms for our generation because Asia is one of the most progressive contemporary art scenes in the world. So, so today I am honored to introduce the four speakers of our sessions, which includes Mr. Tan Bung-hui and Ms. Radha Mahindrus, Professor Huang Jianhong, and Ms. Eso. And each of them, they all represent the important institutions which engage the Asian art scenes as the major narrative makers by their unique curatorial process. At the beginning, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Tan Bung-hui. And Tan Bung-hui now is Vice President of Global Arts and Cultural Programs and Director of Asia Society Museums in New York. He was Assistant Chief Executive at the National Heritage Board in Singapore, and in 2015 he was Artistic Director for Singapore on Phones, the festival, the largest multidisciplinary presentation of contemporary culture from Singapore and also from Southeast Asia in France. He was director of the Singapore Museums from 2009 to 2013. And so one of the most magnificent achievements from him is he initiates the regional folks and group curating approach, which became the methodology of the Singapore's biennials in 2013 if the world changed. And today I think Mr. Tang will introduce about the upcoming Asia Society's triennials in 2020, which might be quite interesting and quite important platforms to represent the contemporary art from Asia to the audience of Western world. When we talk about the idea of trans-Asian cooperations, we should also think about how could we present ourselves to the audience outside of Asian cultural communities. So let us welcome our first speakers.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to Prameya Art Foundation and the National Arts and Culture Foundation of Taiwan for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thank you all in the audience for coming so early on the second day. I'm going to, since this session is about transnational cooperation and curating, I'm going to just focus in the time that I have on two sort of initiatives, one which is existing, the Arts and Museum Summit, and one which is completely new, which is the Asia Society Triennial next year, as a kind of case study for how a very old, a very established institution in the West, in New York, which obviously is one of the global citadels of culture, and take it for all its implications, approaches Asia, or can approach this, the artistic and cultural production of Asia. Just 1 minute just to say, Asia Society was one of the institutions founded by John D. Rockefeller III in the wake of World War II, when literally America had emerged the winner, in a sense, in that particular war. And Mr. Rockefeller, among other things, said that, you know, he felt at that moment in time when America was ostensibly the winner and the new sort of big fish in the global arena, it cannot forget the place where 2/3 of humanity lived, which is Asia. And in fact, he was one of the earliest to also refer to, you know, in a sense, China as a kind of sleeping dragon that one day will awake, and, you know, the fact that America should be prepared. Asia Society, you know, was founded in 1956, and it's become literally the leading educational organization dedicated to promoting understanding and preparing basically Asian Americans and Americans for a shared future. So it's built in our DNA right from 1956. We are not just about promoting what we do, we are ostensibly what we like to refer to as a big tent, you know, where we can work and collaborate with many, many people. We are by nature a non-partisan organization, which is very special. That means all ends of the political spectrum. We don't take sides in that, and we try to give a platform for various kinds of voices. But our main thing is about that Asia and America have a shared future. Whether you like it or not, you can deny it, we're still going to sort of do it. And within Asia Society, Mr. Rockefeller set up 3 pillars. One is policy and business, second is education, and the last was art and culture. And of course, in the art and culture, later on the museum emerged from that, but as well as the other sort of artistic forms, performing arts, film, literature came from that. And he felt that the arts and culture was so important that, against the advice of his actual advisor, Sherman Lee, who was basically instrumental in creating the field of Asian art in the US and later became the director of the Cleveland Museum of Art. Against the advice of his advisor, he decided not to disperse his personal collection of pre-modern art from Asia into the major museums like the Met and so on. That was actually the advice of Sherman Lee. And he instead kept them together and gave the entire collection to the Asia Society, which is why we have one of the most seminal, what we call a tier 1 collection of pre-modern work. And of course the Indian section is understandably extremely famous and has been published in countless sort of books. So in the US, for example, you can't really do a Chola bronze show without borrowing the 1-2 pieces from the Asia Society. So in 2008, one of my predecessors decided that the contemporary art and contemporary artistic expression of Asia was important. And that was very critical in the US for all the sort of assumptions that New York is like, you know, the sort of most progressive area. You must remember that the first exhibition of contemporary Chinese art, real institutional show, the China Inside Out, was only done first by Asia Society in the 90s. Similarly, the first time Indian contemporary art and its relation to craft traditions and artisanal traditions was also done during following that with Edge of Desire. So it's very, very late, so to speak, and of course a lot also has to do with Chai Guoqiang's award-winning appearance at the Venice Biennale towards the end of that decade. So one must understand that the understanding of traditional or pre-modern art in America was much earlier, and contemporary expressions actually came very late. And one of our past presidents, Vishaka Desai, who is of Indian origin, though she has been in the US since she was very young, you know, is famous for telling this story about meeting a very famous kind of curator and programmer at an institution. And she was so stunned when he told her, oh, there's no such thing as contemporary Indian art. You know, we end at the 19th century. And that partly prompted her, you know, to move the Asia Society looking at contemporary kind of work. So that's that. Now I want to talk about one of the things that we always try to do and is very built in is we believe in building friendships and networks of collaboration. And we believe that actually one of the problems is not only that the West or Asia do not have enough contact. In fact, frequently the result is that many Asian institutions are always westward facing. They know more about the Tate, the Met, the MoMA, the Asia Society than they know about their neighbors. And that is a kind of challenge, particularly in a period where in the Asia Pacific is entering a period of cultural infrastructure building, building up curatorial skills systems, registration systems, audience development, support systems. So Asia Society started something called an Arts and Museum Summit. It is a biannual convening focusing on particularly using case study presentations, issues that the museum sector, particularly in the Asia Pacific face. We have a generally we move it since I came to Asia Society 4 years ago. I made the decision to move it around, to move it out of the China region, out of southern China and Hong Kong, and into the Asian region. And I just want to talk a little bit about the event that just happened last month in October, actually in Delhi, where we worked with our local center. And it's important that my preference personally is that each time we move to a city where we have a presence, we have 14 centers around the world, so there's a lot of cities to move to still. Because we felt that we needed to not parachute in our concerns, but to really to work with somebody that is actually on the ground and is activating where possible people in that network. And what we try to do is this summit is not just a strictly academic kind of convening, it's a professional development kind of encounter where over 2 days in this very, very intense summit, we bring together people from the Asia Pacific, and each round we focus on a topic that is of interest to the locality or institutions in the locality in which it is happening. So in Delhi, we focused on collection practices, and that was also an acknowledgement that we are not, that in this country, you are also in a period where you have private collectors that are looking at, how to find a long-term legacy for their collection, how can it become a kind of public museum, and also you're in a moment where there is a kind of also push by the state to, in a sense, relook at the museum. So this is where we've been. So beginning from 2017, I've moved the summit around the Asia Pacific. We started with Manila, where we have a center, and in Manila there is a very active network of museums, and there are many private museums which are functioning essentially as public museums. And in fact, the challenge there was, a lot of people said, was about building a sustainable long-term audience. So that's what the topic was. And the earlier ones in Hong Kong were much more, in a sense, the word is not visionary, but they were much more big picture about what is the motivation for having a museum. And of course, the 2013 edition, the first edition, was also a response to the recent moves in China to build, all these 1,000 museums and so on. And we try and draw through our network as broad a range of speakers from as many different contexts as possible, because we strongly believe that in the Asia Pacific, that you cannot build a museum solely by imitating the Euro-American tradition, which sometimes we call, that is the international standard, because, the contexts are very different. So it was very important to us that we get diversity, cultural diversity, but also professional diversity, including some artists who are involved at various levels in building institutional legacies. And we felt that that was very sort of important. And over the 4 editions, we've also involved, a whole range of institutions, from independent artists run collectives to big national state sort of institutions. And even though it's an Asian Arts and Museum Summit, we actually also bring in delegates from beyond the Asia Pacific sort of region. So I'm not gonna focus, I'm just gonna run through. And each time we go, we also try and get a sense to the delegates we have delegates from this round from Africa, from Latin America, from former Ukraine territory that has been annexed by Russia. So it's very, very diverse. Australia, Southeast Asia, of course, South Asia as well. And we usually try to also plan alongside the academic program, a very deliberate program of helping foreign speakers and delegates understand indigenous attempts, indigenous initiatives in a sense, preserving cultural legacy or building cultural infrastructure. So of course, we had visits to Humayun's tomb and the gardens and so on, where the Aga Khan representatives spoke about what was going on and the challenges, the models that are going on. I don't know why I'm in this picture. We also make a very big effort to visit private collections, because many of these are curators and museums, and we believe that's very, very helpful, because what do museums want to do? They want to loan and obtain gifts of artwork, and we always build that in, and we curate that extremely resourcefully. This is Radhika Chopra's collection, and then we went to Shalini Pasi's home as well to look at some of the work. And as I said, all the speakers that we bring in, we try to be as international. By international, I mean we try to listen to case studies from completely different contexts, because we feel that every context is unique. So the only way to deal with that is for people to be exposed to many different kinds of models. And one of the keynotes for the last month was James Bradburn, who literally was and still is the first non-Italian to be actually hired to run an Italian state museum, and that's a really big deal. And he was the first, and after that, then I think 12 other people joined him. And for health reasons, he couldn't travel at the last minute, so we did a wonderful kind of Skype thing. And he was very interesting, because he spoke about how to use your basically your permanent collection as well as the star piece, rather than rely on blockbusters, which a lot of museums do. And of course, we had Tasnim. We always have this kind of pairing. Kavita from GNU was here, and I'm not going to. And what we did was we also obtained funding. Other than the speakers, we also obtained funding to support delegates in these fields from other places, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Beirut, the Sisok Museum came, from Australia, Eastern Europe, other parts of developing Asia, and we did a workshop for them that is self-facilitated. We appoint one of the younger delegates to facilitate this workshop, and the workshop, of course, is about problems building public collections of art, and how to care for them, how to deal with them, and so on. And all these younger delegates, at the end of the summit, they presented, from their context, how they would deal with this issue. So there were 5 groups, and each one had a particular issue. So this is very important. Actually, it's not what they discussed. Is we wanted them to, as in a sense, the next generation, we wanted them to build new allies and new networks, when they are beginning in their career, So these people, they are not the chief curators, they are not the director levels, they may be like the curators or the managers of education programs and so on. So we felt we just needed to create a special kind of thing that peer networks can build up, and it was important for us that these peer networks be international as well, with people that will grow with them as they progress in their curatorial or artistic careers. And at the same time, it was always very important that we have very senior and much younger professionals, sitting at the same kind of table, friends from Vietnam. And these are the delegates that we brought in separately. Yeah, some people. Okay, so we're already planning the next sort of summit, which will be in another sort of country, and all the panel sessions will be available. We videoed all of them, and all of them will be available very soon. Please check back at the Asia Society website and for that. So that is a particular kind of network building that we feel that it's not achieved in one summit. We have to do it like I think 10 times, and slowly we build a kind of network. And when people have asked us how do we know it succeeded, and I said the answer is, if in another 5 years they don't need this to meet each other already, we've succeeded. I will close this program. Prior to this, there was another program called the US-China Museum Directors Forum, which I closed at the end because the last session, after 5-6 iterations, was so successful that the Chinese museums and the Western, they were organizing projects together. So we said, we've succeeded, let's end this there and then. So I killed the program, and the collaborations are going on. So this is existing. Now I'm going to talk about a new thing, which is the triennial. And if I can just okay. Last month's summit in Delhi, the Arts and Museum Summit, we had about 150 delegates. There were 23 speakers representing 17 countries, and together with the delegates, we had representation from 23 sort of countries. So it's a very sort of diverse kind of gathering. Now, something new, and we change things. We kill things so that we can do new things, and we move on. When I came to New York, I noticed several things. One, that, and a lot of people sort of told me that after the initial burst, the kind of institutional enthusiasm for art from the Asia Pacific seemed to be sort of plateauing, and we're talking mainly about modern and contemporary work. Two, that I was very concerned that the way, and I think our friend from the Rux Media Collective said it yesterday, that the biennial and triennial can do what museums will take 40, 50 years to do. And I was really struck by that. Because when I came to New York, the first thing I noticed was how, in a sense, slow the sort of infrastructure was in registering or even coping with the pace and the sophistication of artistic practice and experimentation outside the Euro-American sphere. That after so many years and a lot of PR propaganda, basically, really the ability institutionally to capture the pace of artistic experimentation outside the Euro-American zone is really sort of not there. And there are very interesting and courageous things happening all over the Asia Pacific that I felt very strongly needed to be sort of registered in New York, because it is, together with London, one of the most important sort of platforms for contemporary expression globally. And also, a lot had to do basically with education and awareness, that actually the awareness of other cultures is actually not that sort of deep. And of course, all of you must know, actually the majority of Americans do not have passports. And the number one country that people travel to is Canada. You sort of go and see the other side of Niagara Falls, but it is what it is. And because of that, then this idea of having a biennial and triennial platform became very important to, in a sense, bring to New York and to the US, a sense of the artistic practice of this particular kind of region and what's going on here. And two, to break some of these silos about and I think it's very important to me that interdisciplinary work be sort of presented, because a lot of young artists are sort of breaking out of that, and frankly it is very difficult to show this kind of work. So the Triennial of Asia will literally be the first such kind of platform in the US, devoted basically to Asia. And the title of the first installment next year is called We Do Not Dream Alone. The title comes from a very famous line by the Asian American artist Yoko Ono in 1964 in her book Grapefruit, which is very interesting. You should try and see it, which is a list of instructions of things you can do, artistic activities you can do in your everyday life. So there is this idea that change begins with the individual meeting another individual and dreaming together in the everyday. And it seemed particularly appropriate in a context and an environment where, in a sense, there is a kind of cynicism about political solutions to the problems of the day, that it is left to the local and regional level to create these kind of innovative platforms. And Asian art from Asia seemed very appropriate because, in a sense, we wanted to bring the voices of artists into these problems. So they are not reflecting, but how art can help us think through some of these kind of challenges that are facing us today. And that's very important. We're not about, we're not so interested in artists reflecting trauma or challenges or dilemmas, but how the artistic process illuminates, or at least starts you thinking about these kinds of issues. And I think also there is this sense that art right now in a place like the US, but in fact the world, is one of the last safe secular spaces where one can have disagreements, where one can have a kind of debate that does not end in a kind of very awful confrontation. And we felt that there was a need to discuss all these issues that we hear and we see on the news, on the hundreds of cable news channels in the US, but at the same time lowering what we call the temperature of debate, that the voices of artists help lower the temperature of debate. So we decided to do this thing called the Triennial of Asia next year, and we sort of describe it as the festival of art, ideas, and innovation for two reasons. One, a very practical reason, that actually it starts a bit earlier. While the core sort of the exhibition is next year, we already have pre-events that are happening from basically this month onwards. And because Asia Society is not just a museum, we wanted to work with our colleagues in policy and in business, in a sense, to bring them in, to see how different disciplines can sort of approach the same kind of issue. Of course, this idea, what I said about not dreaming alone, that artists should be one of the dreamers alongside other dreamers. So it's not just artists standing alone, but artists standing with other people and working with also, where possible, people from other sort of disciplines. We made a decision to make the triennial free. It was very, very important for us because, you know, we are on Park Avenue in the Upper East Side, but sometimes it's very easy for us to forget that a family out in Queens with 2 young children, it's a lot of effort to bring your 2 children to come and see, you know, an exhibition in Manhattan. And what we did was also to in a sense, to break out of our building. So it occurs across multiple venues, and we took great effort to ensure that it was uptown in the Asia Society venue. There is a midtown location, and there is a downtown sort of location, and there are other partner venues. So that was very important. And of course, it's what we have been doing all these kind of years. So, you know, various sort of dispersed locations. Roughly, these may not be the actual wording, but roughly the works in the core exhibition itself will tend to cluster around 4 sort of very broad themes, none of which should be unfamiliar to anyone. We put a lot of focus on showing artists who are very established, who have had monographs, who have shown in biennials and triennials and museum presentations in Europe and Asia, but have not really been seen institutionally in the US. And with Asian artists, there is a lot of them. And also, no surprises, when we totaled up the list, women are more than men. There are more women artists who fall into this category than men. I'm not going to comment on that. That's another kind of thing. But I do want to emphasize it's not a numbers game. We did not choose women artists because they are women. It's very important that we understand that. It's just the outcome. It was not the direct kind of intention. And because we believe that the artists we chose were the most exciting of the moment. And of course, you know, we hope to get, everyone wants to get a younger generation. Together with the partners, these are some of the statistics. Of course, it's slightly catered to New York because New York, the number of people that come to New York to see art in that period is extremely high because of the tourists. And of course, we'll have a lot of stuff. This is sort of important because just let you know, so the opening weekend is actually June 3rd and 4th. That's the vernissage. It opens to the public on June the 5th, and it continues until sort of August 9th. And we have a steering committee of very, you know, illustrious kind of people throughout the entire sort of spectrum of the broad creative sort of industry who advise us and who help us with various sort of things, and it's one of the perks of being Asian Society. You know, these people are within our network. So this timeline is quite important. So we will announce the first list of artists. Probably we'll announce the new commissions first in December, and from January onwards, just have 2 minutes more. From January onwards, we will start a kind of what we call regional presentations, because we don't want the artists as much as possible to just appear in New York. We want the opportunity to introduce the artists to the region from which they originate. And on that, just a very important note that if you come to the exhibition, you will see we don't actually identify the artists by country, simply because of the problem of diasporic artists, but also artists that literally, you know, no matter how they look, they grew up in a specific culture that may be like, we have 2 artists who are based in London, and they constantly struggle with the fact that they look Asian, but they're completely un-Asian because they're English, literally. So I think there is a kind of also querying that is going on. But we will come back to the period of the Indian Art Fair early next year after Singapore to also have a program with the artists that are coming from this kind of region. The event is multidisciplinary. There is a very strong performance and performing arts program. There is a film program that will be guest curated by Giovanna Fulvi, who is one of the first people who first sort of curated film from Asia into the West. And of course, all these things you all know. There are many partners. This is like 6 months ago. Many people are going on ahead. So we hope that everybody will come and support this, because really it's a kind of thing that if Asians need to help themselves, because no one owes us a living, and if we want to be successful in the West, in New York, we need to come together and have a kind of show of force. You see this at the Venice Biennale, all the Europeans and so all coming together, and if we don't succeed, it's our own fault, I think, literally. But I think this is very important to kickstart again another kind of wave of interest in the Asia Pacific. And right now we're very excited by the fact that the response has been so tremendous. Patron groups from our various centers are organizing their own caravans to come to the opening, and various institutions are coming on. We've just announced a new, it's not here, but as of yesterday, we've just confirmed a new collaboration with the New York Philharmonic to have a public work at the David Geffen Hall in Lincoln Center, and it's impossible to get anything in Lincoln Center. So that's a testament to the seriousness with which institutions are now viewing this initiative in New York. So thank you all. Happy to take questions. I'm afraid I can't say too much about the artists because we're still trying to sign contracts and get people to support particular artists, but we will announce some of these names in December. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Radha Mahenjus, and Radha is the senior curator and program manager at Coach, and I think most of the local audience are quite familiar with Coach. And she conceptualizes, plans, and executes residencies, exchange seminars, and public programs for Coach, along with other members of the curatorial teams. And Radha has been working with Coach since 2015 and dealing with socially engaged art practice and fundraising projects. As a curator, she is interested in creative practice that interact with ecologies, gender, and digital humanities. And yesterday I just chatted with Radha about for the art people from the east part of the Asians. When I asked them about the Indian contemporary arts institutions, they always come up the first name is Coach. So which means Coach is quite a success in a way. So is it okay? Okay. So I think I will invite Radha to start her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. As most of you may already know, Khoj International Artists Association is a not-for-profit contemporary arts organization that is based in New Delhi. Starting its journey in 1997 as an annual artists workshop that aimed to challenge and push the boundaries of creative practice in the country, Khoj has grown into an institution that acts as an incubator and catalyst for contemporary art practices, making them more relevant, critical, expansive, and inclusive of larger multidisciplinary practices. We do this through a variety of programs that include workshops, residencies, exhibitions, talks, socially engaged art projects, and publications. And it primarily serves the artistic community at the national, regional, and international level by providing financial, physical, and intellectual space for artists and art practice. So what's been interesting for me has been that Khoj as an organization began by knowing everything it wasn't. And for someone who's been a part of 5 years of its 22-year-old journey, it's been very interesting to kind of investigate and try to identify the key plots that have moved it in this direction, and to find how every small impulse has very beautifully led to its coming journey. And so to go back to the very beginning, this is a very old, one of the oldest high-res pictures we have of an international workshop from I think 2000 or 2001. The idea of Khoj began as a gift of possibility with the generous support of Robert Loader, founder of the Triangle Arts Trust. At a time when Indian artists felt isolated and unsupported, Khoj provided the possibility for young practitioners to create an open-ended experimental space for themselves on their own terms. Khoj would be the space where they could make art independent of formal academic and cultural institutions and outside the constraints of commercial gallery, a chance to establish international networks without institutional support. And over here I'd like to just give a mini quote from the first Khoj workshop catalog in 1997. I think it was edited by Anita Dubey, who was a participating artist, and Ajay Desai, who was the coordinator of that workshop. Our aim was basically to function as an experimental art laboratory that would bring artists together from different parts of the country, from the subcontinent and from around the globe, setting up a cooperative, non-hierarchical work situation where dialogue, exchange, and transfer of energy, skills, and information could take place in an intensely lived experience. Khoj is an emblem of our vision of working together in difficult situations, somehow pushing against the establishment grain under the rubric of creating sensitizing encounters, opening up insularities and closures to address binary polarizations that have hardened into unchangeable positions both inside and outside. And in continuation with that, over the next 5 years of international workshops that would happen once a year in the outskirts of Delhi in Modi Nagar, Khoj sustained friendships and solidarities with contemporary creative practitioners from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, at a time when the region was seeing some of its most violent clashes over national borders. And it was so that in 2000 that the seeds were sown of South Asia Network for the Arts, SANA as it's called, a collaboration that established similar alternative art spaces in the region, such as Brito in Bangladesh, Basel in Pakistan, Tirtha in Sri Lanka, and Sutra in Nepal. Jagat is here, so I'm guessing you're going to hear more from him tomorrow. And after doing 5 successful international workshops in Modi Nagar, the working group felt that despite the organizational and logistical comfort that had been reached in Delhi, it was time to re-envision the international workshop and give it a fresh impetus. And in a desire to grow the scene, which did not necessarily depended on physically scaling up Khoj, it was decided that the next international workshops would happen in different locations across India, mostly in tier 2, tier 3 cities, where there was some kind of an interest or a core group of young practitioners who just needed some kind of a push and a support system to some extent formalize a structure that could ensure its somewhat sustainability. And so the next international workshops were held in Mysore, in Bangalore, in Srinagar, in Patna, in Dharamshala, and most recently in Goa. And in continuation with this, from 2000 to 2011, Khoj also supported 3 not-for-profit artist-led initiatives in different parts of the country, which were at their inception stage. These were Camp in Mumbai, Desire Machine Collective in Guwahati, and One Shanti Road in Bangalore. And it's quite heartening to see that these still exist and thrive and have taken on their own lives and journeys. And so while this was continuing and the network building was happening in Sana and through the international workshops, in 2002, Khoj also moved into its first permanent studio space, which was in Khirki, which is also its current location. And I think this was a very important moment because it changed Khoj's practice in a very specific and steady direction, and actually has led us to the moment that we are at just now. So with a permanent studio space, actually, it offered the possibility of experimenting with residency models, with focusing on certain research areas, with focusing on certain kind of art practices, pushing the boundaries of certain mediums, encouraging creative practices of practitioners who did not identify as artists, and in some cases definitely did not want to identify as artists, like Asim Waqif, who was an architect and was very, very hesitant up until fairly recently to be called an artist, or Kalol Datta, who was a fashion designer and I think has had his first solo maybe 2 years ago at Experimento. And so there was a series of residencies that would happen at Khoj, which were ranging from food to fashion to ecology, to public art, community-based art practices, live art and sound art. And this brings me to the year when I joined Khoj, which was in 2015. This is the area in which Khoj is. That's the Khidki village. Khidki is an urban village, one of the 39 urban villages that exist within the NCR boundary. These villages are very, very interesting because at one point of time they were in the outskirts of the city, but as the city grew, they kind of got engulfed and became like these intense, largely populated, dense urban clusters which had poor infrastructure but were kind of the lifelines of the city. And in the middle of all this is Khoj, this contemporary arts organization, which kind of marks itself with its building and its pristine white walls in a very, very dense neighborhood. When I joined in 2015, Khoj had just initiated a residency called Curatorial Effect, Currents Across India and Africa. It was a residency that grew out of a series of encounters and conversations that had taken place around Khoj all through 2014. And these conversations were actually built on a very notorious incident that happened in 2013, 4 houses down from Khoj, where Somnath Bharti, the AAP MLA from that area, actually tried to conducted an illegal raid on 2 Ugandan women, accusing them of being prostitutes and drug dealers. And it was the first time that kind of the racist tendencies and the violent tendencies that we have were very obviously thrown into our face. And to be confronted with this immediate violence and that is happening in your own neighborhood when you're an organization that works with the arts, which is extremely political and careful of its and mindful of its politics. It was a time to reflect and see how does an arts institution respond to something like this. And through that, in 2015, Coriolis Effect was born. The residency sought to activate social, economic and cultural relationships and historical exchange which existed between India and the continent of Africa. And I think, just to go back to a bit about Khidki, the reason why this incident also happened in Khidki was because increasingly in the last few years it was noticed that while there were already a lot of migrant laborers living in Khidki from parts of India, there was an increasing influx of economic migrants coming and medical tourism and climate refugees, refugees coming from Somalia, from Afghanistan, economic migrants from Cameroon, Nigeria, Kenya. And living in this dense space together there were lots of small incidences and everyday racism that was being felt. So the first year was interesting because it kind of opened up a lot of questions, and because we had a cross-section of artists, there was a lot of interesting observations made, a lot of interesting work produced, a lot of work that happened in Khidki responding to this particular incident since it was so fresh. But the logic or the premise of a residency that sought to look at the relationships between India and all of Africa, which is the continent, kind of felt a bit weak. And so the next year we tried to further narrow it down by trying to focus on specific themes of migration and memory. And that, while that was slightly better, we still felt like there was something missing in it. And so in the third edition, we kind of widened and intensified the scope of our project by focusing on the Indian Ocean world. And I think that was a very, very interesting thing for us because it also helped us kind of rethink of our regionalisms and our alignments in a slightly different way. Concentrating largely on the Indian Ocean world helped bring and foreground other kinds of histories which weren't so neatly tied to nationalized borders. So there was a lot of interesting work around the smuggling trade routes, the slave trade, the Tao culture, the current day 21st century migrations, the new colonization that's happening off parts of Africa by big corporates of India. And that kind of gave a certain validation to that there is something here that should be further worked on. It was also in 2015 that Khoj began its partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation to identify and nominate exceptional Asian artists for a 1-month residency at the Bellagio Center in Italy to raise visibility of artists across Asia and to enable exceptional artists from the region to advance their work through this prestigious program. It was actually with this project and this edition of the Coriolis Effect Residency that we were able to kind of connect and build our networks reconnect with some of the older organizations that Khoj had been working with during its first international workshops and connect with entirely new regions and organizations that we did not have any chance to even interact with. And from there was a need that was felt to initiate a conversation that could discuss strategies and exchange ideas of collective speculation on new frameworks of our time, that could help us speculate on the new frameworks of our time. This is the Coriolis Effect Residency. And this brings us to Asia Assemble. Between 1405 and 1433, a Muslim eunuch led 7 imperial Chinese treasure fleets from South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and West Africa. Kidnapped by Ming armies from his home in provincial Yunnan, Admiral Zheng He, as he would become to known, rose to power in the imperial capitals of Beijing and Nanjing. Today he is widely celebrated as a military mastermind, a diplomatic genius, a peaceful envoy. Museums, mosques, and artifacts are now appearing around the region in celebration of his 7 epic voyages across South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. The Chinese government has pumped millions of dollars into Sri Lanka and Kenya, countries that are key nodes of China's new Silk Route infrastructure network, to support the search for the remains of his fleet. The spectral re-emergence of Zheng He and his fleet in geopolitics, visual culture, and cultural diplomacy may be taken as a point of entry into the complex web of questions surrounding iconographies, cultural appropriations, and the definitional instabilities of Asia. Asia Assemble was a 3-day gathering of artists, practitioners, academics, and art institutions from around Asia in New Delhi in November 2017. Structured as a series of moderated conversations, discussions, screenings, and public presentations, the convening sought to understand the possibilities, modalities, and urgencies of arts and cultural work around Asia. It was generously supported by Shergill Sundaram Arts Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Goethe Institute, Max Muller Bhavan, New Delhi. In our individual, collective, and organizational capacities, we continue to understand and negotiate our local, national, and continental conditions to respond to the immediacies in a largely ambiguous Asia. Khoj enters this conversation from the perspective that Asia has never been purely self-delimited, but rather the product of interaction with other regions. New imaginations of Asia are not an affirmation of Asia-centricism, but rather an attempt to overcome a logic dominated by egocentrism, exclusivity, and expansionism. We ask, where is the silk in the new Silk Route? In an era of neoliberal governmentality, resurgent nationalism, and democracy with Chinese characteristics, can we find possibilities of coexistence and communication in other Asian structures? How do arts, receiving funding sometimes from states, sometimes from regional bodies, sometimes from international organizations and multinational corporations, play into existing and emergent structurings? Even as archaeologists continue to identify a wreck believed to have belonged to Zheng He, what fantastical fleets do we need to find ourselves on to traverse these strange waters? And so began our Asia Assemble. And it was a really interesting process to kind of come up with the logic and framework of this convening, because we were very keen that while it has to focus on the politics of the different regions and therefore the limitations that come with it, the conversation for us was important that it was centered in art practice, art making, and what institutions and creative practitioners are doing to negotiate this within their regions, across regions, and what are the solidarities, strategies that we can exchange over here and build together. And towards the same, it was also interesting to note how we came up with the configuration of people that came here. The convening was designed with a keynote and a respondent every day, and then 4 curated sessions. And Patrick was giving the opening keynote. It was ironical that we had kind of reconnected with Patrick Flores at a conference in Athens earlier that year at the Creative Time Summit, where Zulekha and I were presenting another Khoji's project, and Patrick was there presenting the Southeast Asian contingent. And it took us to go to Europe to kind of find each other and come back and meet in this part of the world. Some of the, how we decided to structure the conversations were to kind of identify some of these patterns and political commonalities that exist, which range from migration and labor movements to the One Belt, One Road initiative, to the censorship that people are working with, to the bordered realities of our contexts. And it was, what was I think really, really interesting for us, and I'll just end with some of the conversations that happened and the feedback and the patterns that came up was that the nature of institutions in Asia, especially art institutions which are not museums, which are not art galleries, which are not foundations working towards specific large format exhibitions, is that they are very hybrid and amphibious in nature, because they have to be multi-purpose and serve many different needs in different scales, and kind of expand and elasticize their idea of their contexts and the sites in which they inhabit. And what was absolutely remarkable was to see the kind of resilience that was required to even keep these institutions alive and sustainable, because financial sustainability is a big, big problem. We still struggle with the fact that most of our funding depends on Eurocentric funding agencies, often which are cultural diplomacy wings, which come by their own limitations of exchanges. And how does one negotiate all these? And more closely in South Asia, what do you do when you cannot get a visa for a person to come from Pakistan? And does that mean you stop working over there? And if that's not an option, then how do you find other ways of participating, of continuing that work and that dialogue and that collaboration? And I think the other interesting thing that came up over here was that what are then, if we think in this landscape, what are the Asian or non-Western forms and modes of these institution making, these exchanges that can emerge, which perhaps have a certain slowness to them also, which then works well with the biennales and the museums that we've been speaking about, because they do something very different in building a certain network and a solidarity. And they're often very firmly based on personal relationships, and there is a certain strength and a sustainability to that, which is quite remarkable. And I think I would end with kind of trying to think about how do we define how there is perhaps a need and a desire to produce new regionalisms which are outside of these state-defined borders, which break the logic of South Asia, of Southeast Asia, of the Middle East. And in that, how do we do that through the arts? And I will end by just reading a small quote from one of my current favorite artists. He's a post-internet artist, Brad Tromel, and this was a meme essay that he had posted just yesterday. Art is not politics because political engagement is bad. Art is not politics because politics is already politics. In attaching itself so directly to politics, art is doomed to suffer the same failure of imagination politics currently suffers from. What art offers is an expansion of the overtone window, creativity beyond functionality, a chance for people to feel like human beings again instead of alienated subjects. For art to have any impact in the world, political or otherwise, art must stop asking itself, what can art do to help politics? But ask instead, what can art do that politics can't? Thank you.
It's quite inspiring, especially the relationship. And we welcome the next speaker, Professor Wang Jianhong from Taiwan. And Professor Wang is Associate Professor from Institute of Transdisciplinary Art in Taipei National University of Arts. And also, he is the director of one Museum of Fine Art, which is also located in the University of Arts as well. And the Guangdong Museum of Fine Arts always plays important platforms for translation, curatorial exchange. And Professor Wang himself was one of the most important senior curator in Taiwan. He also created a very important institution, which also includes depicted harmonies in 2015's institution, featuring the Taiwan, Japan, Korean, and Chinese artists creator. And yesterday, in our discussions, we discussed the issues between virtual reality and the forums. And Professor Wang's recent extension projects names justice, power, colonials, and technologies, which is being shown in Museum of Contemporary Arts Taipei in 2008. It's also an important dialogue to open the notice between the colonialized dialogue and the technical or digital social context. So, please.
And firstly, thank you very much for the invitation of Prameya Foundation and National Foundation of Taiwan. Okay, thank you. And with this title, Thinking on the Para-Colonial Situation in Curating, I would like to present firstly, with the project just mentioned by Nobel, it's Trans-Justice and Para-Colonial Art Technology. And then I will back to the project Discordant Harmony that was a collaborative project with Song Jong Kim, Yu Kie, and Carol Lu. And then I would like to explain what kind of project in the program of the Guangdong Museum, how we collaborate with the curators, and what kind of program we forward in the future and now. And so, firstly, I would like to share with you some clip video, and yeah, so I needed to opt for a moment. So the first one was the commercial video made by Ridley Scott for Apple in 1984. So in this video, Scott tried to mention 1984 by and he tried to use the layout image with the monitor of Macintosh. Another one is the presentation by Jobs himself.
All of the images you are about to see on the large screen will be generated by what's in that bag.
So this presentation of a Macintosh computer was like a magic show.
It's truly great to get out of that bag. Like Andrew public speaking, I'd like to share with you a lesson I saw the first time I made an idea in this reading. Never trust a computer to graduate. But right now, I'd like to sit back and listen. So it is considerable pride that I introduce a man who's been like a father to me, Steve Jobs.
And he was very touchy. So with these two clips, we could see the Apple computer would like to give the new promise to the future, and on this year 1984. So we could I want to share another short movie by Chris Marker. This movie also made on 1984. And the title is 2084.
2084 intergalactic television's anchor robot has been programmed to celebrate in the following terms the bicentennial of the 1884 French law, generally regarded as the starting point of the trade union movement in France.
They were commissioned on this, things we know. And because we know them, in a certain way they seem less dangerous. We should be able to see them coming. It's not easy to foresee a world where the technical developments replace ideology. Perhaps because it rhymes so neatly. The process is called technology. The appropriation of this technology, who is to benefit from it, who should control its development, was the overriding question of the late 20th century. It's a real challenge. Because we didn't understand in time what was really at stake, it was left for a new type of leader to govern the future, the techno-totalitarians. Not that the handover went smoothly. It was a heavy price to pay. The violent workers' revolts of the 80s and 90s and their repression are remembered now with the same condescending regret as the revolt of the silk workers who threw the first looms into the Rhone River. They didn't see progress coming, poor guys, but who would ever help them to see? Today, we never had it so good. All your needs taken care of. No effort, no strain, no pollution, no waiting in lines, no aggressiveness. All that belongs to a bygone age. At home, you get more images than your eyes can absorb and more information than your memory can stop. A free press, independent radio and TV, For what? They provide still more information than you would have to choose to think, perhaps even to get angry. Anger too belongs to a bygone age. The state is a well-oiled feeding machine, and the union nothing more than the engineer who keeps it working, the one who detects the little glitches, little breakdowns, and who can't even imagine that the machine could serve some other purpose. In fact, of union, only the name remains. Trade unionism passed away with the dawn of the year 2000 by dint of fighting the wrong fight, category against category, native born against immigrant, man against woman, trade union against trade union. The heirs of the labor movement definitively lost the confidence of the class within which they were already a minority. The nuts and bolts which flew across workshops in the winter of 1984 went a long way. They ended up by smashing the very image of trade unionism. The techno-totalitarians only had to pick up the pieces. The third alternative.
Okay, with this clip of 2084 made by Chris Marker, and this movie was a project that was the worker union CFDT, the biggest worker union in France, to ask Chris Marker to make one documentary or one short movie to dedicate the 100 years anniversary of the union. But Chris Marker had the idea because 100 years later, the union collapsed already. There's no more possibility for the worker union. So he said the only hope for the workers should be 100 years later. So he made this movie 2084 and to say in the future what the dominator will be the technology. Yeah, so at the time in this movie, and he used Mini-Dell. Mini-Dell is a kind of microcomputer used popularly in France during the 80s. So I share this clip. Want to say during the 80s. One side, we see the promise from the Apple company, and the other side from Chris Marker, it's a kind of critical profit. So I want to share another clip, and that was the East Wind by Jean-Luc Godard.
Si, c'est vrai, problème mal posé, problème faussement résolu. Mettre réellement les problèmes sur le tapis. Exemple, analyser en termes de classe les effets du discours du 23 juin 1931 sur nouvelle situation, nouvelle tâche de l'édification économique. Exemple, 37-38. À la demande du camarade Staline, Serge Eisenstein commence le tournage du pré de Belgique sur la lutte pour la socialisation des campagnes. 37-38. Guerre d'Espagne. En alliance avec les milices anarchistes, les paysans pauvres organisent un partage immédiat des terres. Ils sont liquidés au nom de la lutte contre l'anarchisme par les commissaires politiques du PC espagnol qui appliquent mécaniquement les directives de l'international. Posez la question pourquoi, mais aussi poser la question contre quoi. Image stalinienne. Posez réellement cette question. Dans ce qui a été fait, aspect positif, avoir montré qu'une image n'est rien, qu'il n'y a pas d'image en soi, qu'il n'y a pas d'image au-dessus de la lutte de classe, d'avoir montré avec une image de Staline. Aspect négatif, n'avoir pas trouvé d'image juste, c'est-à-dire nécessaire et suffisante. Staline et Mao recherchés pour meurtre par le capital était une image de répression nécessaire mais non suffisante. Il faut lui ajouter d'autres images de répression, les seules que nous sachions faire actuellement.
So I want to say with all these clips share with you, I want to say 1984 represents an endless nightmare of dominance that changes always its face. We could see the promise from Apple through Jobs and Ridley Scott, then we see the prophetical warning from French filmmaker Chris Marker about the dominance of technology after the collapse of the workers' union. What interested me in this clip, one with a wonderful promise and the other one with a tragic prophet, is the mutation from biopolitical governance to cybernetic governance since the last 10 years of the 20th century until now. So with this concern, I continue to question when began our experiences of modern technology in Taiwan, and how was this modernization related to the colonial region and to the para-colonial relationship after Second World War. And finally, this project focuses on the issue of the encounter of modernity and coloniality on 2017. Yeah, so I think with this idea from biopolitical governance to cybernetic governance, I would like to say, of course, we had a lot of discussion about colonialism and post-colonialism, but we could find all this discussion should be put in the frame, in a historical and a geological frame. And, but nowadays, in the everyday life, we could feel easily there's some like a micro dominance everywhere. So we would like to see what kind of relationship between this micro dominance and the technology. That's the start point of the project Transjustice. Yeah. So firstly, we organized one like a research group, and we try to refine when the modern technology was introduced into Taiwan. And also we make the timeline also with the important event in the development of the Western world. So for example, we could find this map. This map is the map for the project by Japanese government. How to make the disposition of the electricity in Taiwan, and so we try to when we have this kind of idea, we try to discuss and try to find the artists. They are not really the artists of new media or the artists of the technology, but we want to find the artists who care about the different kinds of dominance or different kinds of post-colonization or something, and then we discuss with these artists and how the technology played a role in their project. Yeah, so we search some document and some artists, and we make a kind of narrative of this project. So in this project, we don't really limit the selection of artists in the Asia framing, but we try to find the artist and make the discussion based on the artist's creation. So we could see, for example, here we choose someone have the creative idea to announce the different era, the new era will come. And so even we choose one politician and a filmmaker and also one terrorist and one artist band. And also we try to figure out the history of the machine. And so we mix like a filmmaker and a video artist, and then we will see like Wu Qiyu or Muskiki, they focus on the dominance of the machine, but another one focus on the dominance from the history of colonization. So we have this kind of composition for the narrative of this project. Yeah, and so this is the final layout of this project. Yeah. And so with this project, and also with the idea of the para-colonial, we would like to how to say to open the discussion about some idea. The first one is how we could rethink the justice, and this problem in Taiwan is very specific because since a long time, since the how to say since the denouncement of the martial law during the late 80s, we have a lot of discussion about the transitional justice. Yeah, but every time when the people discuss about the transitional justice, we could find easily the people will simplify the history and also some kind of political value. So it's very easy to find, we cannot find the result of the discussion. So the first point is how we could rethink the justice, and with this subject, I discussed with Jacques Rancière, and then we forward some discuss with the mechanical ethic by Aristotle. That means the justice is no more the right, but the justice is a kind of moderate. So with this idea from Aristotle about the justice as moderate, that means the justice is a kind of balance or equilibrium in certain ecology system. It's not the absolute idea about the right or fault. Yeah. So and the second point about this project is how we think about the technology as essential expression of para-colonial operation. Of course, this is the para-colonial. It's a kind of new in this discussion, and I want to say because after the fractalization of the social relationship, and also the fragmentation of the network, we'll make this this dominant relationship is cannot be only represented under the framing of the state or of the history. Yeah, but it's more flexible in the capital flow and also information flow. So we want to say the technology or technique play a very important role to decide or to form a different kind of dominance during very long history. Okay, so this is the first, second idea about this project, and the third one we have more collaboration with UQI, and to develop how we could deeper the idea about the technique and the purposes of how we could discuss the technique with aesthetic together. And so this kind of research is to figure out how it's possible to have this para-colonization. Yeah. So because of the time, so I back to another project. Another project is a kind of collaborative project. It's called Harmony, and with this project, later was Song Jong Kim, the director of the Guangzhou Biennial Foundation, and she invited UK Prameya, Carol Lu, and me to join this project focused on the discussion of Asia. And at a later moment, we will, all of us, we would like to deeper the discussion about the cultural and the political context. So that's why at the first moment of this project, we decided not to enlarge the network until the South Asia or Southeast Asia. And with this, yeah. So I would like to explain a little bit what we would like to experiment in this project. And so in this project, we have the purpose to make a tour exhibition. But we want to say, we have the consciousness about why or what kind of issue we could discuss together in the different regions or different countries. And I think the most important, of course, that was Song Jong, who proposed that perhaps the Cold War should be the first important international frame or structure that affect every region. So we could discuss from the Cold War, and then we could share. What we could share is this kind of international structure, and then how we forward this project. That means because every venue or every region had a different concern and a different perspective about the Cold War. So we try to organize one group of artists, but in every venue, we will rediscuss about the main facing the system, the static system and the international system. And the fourth venue, we focus on the avant-gardist movement during 80s. So the fourth venue was in inside our museum in Beijing. Yeah, so yeah, this is for example, we had Chen Jiezhen and Ko Qi and Byung Jun Huang and Leng Jiwo and Liu Ding, and of course. Our first impression, we will find these artists are not very similar to each other. Yeah, but because we study on the their context of their project, of their own project, so we could find the common narrative guideline between their works. Yeah, this is the installation image. Yeah, so at that time, we try to interview the artists and try to find their keywords and try to analyze how the intensity of each keyword. Yeah, so. So with these two projects, I think with the discordant harmony, that was the project from 2015 to 2018, and from the trans justice, that was 2017 to 2018. And with these two projects, I would like to insist that. We four curators work together, or I work with the research group. We focus on the reading of the historical and the political context, and then we try to discuss with the artists based on this research, and then try to. Normally, the step was like this: the artist will decide which work they want to join this exhibition, and then we decide the narrative of the exhibition. So with this, I think because I added 2 pages of the exhibition of Guangdong Museum, but this is the older one, so so I missed 2 pages, and I would like to show with these 2 pages is in the program of Guangdong Museum. We try to collaborate with the curators, the curators outside of the museum, to forward this kind of project. Their projects always focus on the cultural research and combine how the modernization of the technology in Asia. So we had already 1 project, that means love letter, cellulose, and post-war. And later was 1 project collaborated with the Indonesian artists. So we had a lot of workshop in both sides, and then the artists exchange their idea about the colonization history and also the development of the technology. And the other one is a collaborative project with Korean artists and Taiwanese artists. And this project was represented in Seoul, the Loop space. And this project focused on the history of the Japanese occupation period. And because the feeling of the Taiwanese people and the Korean people facing the Japanese occupation period, was very, very different. So, so we try to make one female curator, Cai Jiazhen. She tried to make this dialogue between Korean artists and the Taiwanese artists facing the Japanese occupation, the colonization period, and the current show in Guangdong Museum. The title is on how to say, it's difficult to understand because the title is butcher, but butcher is nonsense. But it's come from the 不错, the Chinese it's nice, 不错. But the three guest curators they decided not to translate the title with the words, but with the body. So they transform 不错 is nice as butcher. But in these three guest curators, two are artists, one from Taiwan and one from South Korea, and the other one curator from Thailand. She is a writer. So all of the three, then we discuss about the life art and the performance from the gender performance until the education program. So we make like 40 workshop during this exhibition now. Yeah. So I try to share my main concern about my curatorial projects, but also I also share the direction. One of the direction of a museum to develop the dialogue between the transcultural experiences about colonization and technology. Thank you.
And finally, we reach the last speakers. First result, and Ms. Result is public journalist with Asia Art Archive, Hong Kong-based independent non-profit organization initiated in 2000 in response to the urgent need to document and make accessible the multiple recent history of art in the regions. And of course, Asia Archive was one of the most significant contributions of the art history archive in the regions. And I think for this today's discussion, we talked a lot about the biennials and museums and also the curating projects and also the residency projects. And open of all of these projects, I think the fundamental of the curatorial research should be the archiving. So it might be a really important issue to discuss. So please discuss the application.
Thank you, Nobo, for this. You can't hear me well. 1 second, let's try this. Is this better? The mic is not on. Let's see. Is that the one? No. It's working now? Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nobo, for the generous introduction. And thank you, Prameya Art Foundation and National Culture and Arts Foundation Taiwan for having me. It's an honor to be here. So I would like to start my talk with an image of Tycho. Tycho is a supernova in the Cassiopeia constellation. It's one of the 8 supernovas that are visible to the naked eye in historical records. And I encountered this image around 1 month ago when I started taking notes for today's presentation. And in the late 16th century, this astronomer called Tycho, he noticed this bright object in the sky, and he speculated this was a new star that was far beyond the moon, and it was possible that there could be a universe that was far beyond the sun. So today we know that it's not new star, but it's a supernova. That's an explosion so bright that it can outshine the light from an entire galaxy. So the story goes that Tycho spent 25 years of his life looking and documenting the movement of celestial objects. And when he was asked why he did what he did at the end of 25 years, he said, "I've been just trying to understand the universe." And he added, if someone continued this research later, he would have saved that person 25 years of labor. So perhaps this is what we think about around archives as well. Archives are often seen as mapping exercises. Unlike collections, perhaps there is no imperative within the logic of an archive to exhibit or interpret its holdings. So archives document, they organize, they preserve things for future researchers. So they don't, they designate some sort of a territory, but they don't necessarily generate a narrative. And this is precisely the conception of an archive that we try to dismantle at Asia Art Archive. We exhibit our holdings. We think about the archive as a method to develop programs and make connections. So in this exercise, Asia becomes an anchoring point, almost like an imaginary anchoring point, not necessarily a region that we define or confine ourselves in, but it's a starting point where we follow artists to look where they go, whom they talk to, and how they contribute to different communities that they are part of across geographies. So today I would like to speak about AAA and its public programs, and I really hope that this will be an opportunity to speak about curating with an equal emphasis on public programs and exhibition making. So here at this point, for those of you who are less familiar with Asia Art Archive, I will backtrack a little bit and speak just a little bit about the history of the organization. This is our library in Hong Kong. AA started 19 years ago in 2000, and it was created in response to the need to document contemporary art in Asia. And since then, we've been developing a collection of primary and secondary materials. And we have over 88,000 items today, which are freely accessible from our physical space in Hong Kong that you can see in the image, and also from our website. In 2000, we started as one shelf with books, and this is how the library has grown into over the last 19 years. So here you will find reference books, exhibition catalogs, periodicals, monographs, as well as grey literature, ranging from self-published catalogs to zines by artists and arts organizations. So this is a photograph of the vault, where we have some physical archival holdings that are donated by artists, curators, and art historians. In the early years, I should add that, in the early years that our researchers worked almost like journalists or chroniclers of the present. So they would go to exhibitions, they would document the exhibitions, they would take photographs with the artists, they would conduct interviews. And in the next stage, and over the last decade or so, AA has grown in terms of the archival collections with materials that would go back to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s as well. So collected by our researchers, these materials are organized in close collaboration with the artists who own these archival materials. They are digitized and made available on our website. This was an unexpected background music, but thank you. So our team wanted to shift this focus to digital collections, or research collections, as we call them, because we prefer to allocate our resources to increase access to information on less visible histories, and especially when the materials are not that easily accessible. So we are not also very interested in taking the physical collections out of their place or accumulate everything in one city. So instead, we become the organizers, the facilitators, and the mediators of these archives. Just to give you a couple of examples, and I'll be very quick with these, we have items from the personal archives of very important practitioners, such as Gita Kapuram Vivan Sundaram, including the documentation of the renowned Kasoli Art Center, as well as catalogs, newspaper clippings, and artist slides around India's art scene since the 1960s. Another example would be Salima Hashmi Archive, focusing on a selection of published and as well as unpublished articles and writings by the foundational Lahore-based artist, curator, and educator, who organized women artists and co-wrote manifestos about the status and representation of women artists in Pakistan in the 1980s. Yet another example is the personal archive of Habib Chun, the late Hong Kong-based artist who's primarily known as a sculptor and printmaker. And Habib Chun has a lesser-known practice of photographing every exhibition that he visited, starting with the 1960s. And this is one of the focuses that we have for this particular archive. And it constitutes one of the most comprehensive documentations about recent history in Hong Kong. So making these historical archival materials online has pushed us to think more about our role, about how to interpret them. So when we build programs around these materials, we try to think about that. Every year we develop a thematic series of programs so that we can go deeper with the research questions that we have, and then we can create communities for each and single of these research questions. We also try to think about breadth, I would say. We create programs always in collaborations with artists, researchers, and like-minded organizations so that we can multiply the reference points across different fields and geographies. And when I say reference points, I specifically refer to what Professor Mukherjee was talking about in her introduction yesterday. So I refer to Chen Guangxing's book, Asia as Method, where he writes that we need to imagine alternative frames of reference so that the societies in Asia and those those who are in the global south may become each other's points of reference. So what you are looking at is a network map of all the programs that we organized in the last year. These talks, workshops, screenings, exhibitions, and teacher programs are connected to each other through common themes. They are the ones in orange color. So you would see exhibition histories, art writing, pedagogy, which are all included in our research priorities. And you will also see that the biggest cluster is on the top, and it's organized around performance art, which was our, let's say, content priority for the thematic way to think about our programs in the last year. And this is the first set of programs that I would like to share with you today. Maybe a couple of words about why performance art. Performance art has been one of our research priorities for almost a decade, and we are especially interested in the ephemeral quality of this particular medium, which is very crucial to understand in Asia because many artists have used this particular medium to respond to urgent social and political needs, especially in the context of censorship. We are also interested in this medium because often performance is considered as this unmediated medium. If there's a performance, you go into the space, you are with the body of the artist. If you're not there, you miss it, and then maybe you catch it the next time. But most of the performances we actually know, they're not necessarily the ones that we saw in person, but they are the ones that we got to know about through restagings, through photographs, through videos, so through documents or documentation. So we are interested in exploring the role of the archive and the role of the document to understand and to study or to interpret this particular art form. Last year, we finished digitizing the first phase of the personal archive of Li Wan, a foundational artist for the genre of performance art in Singapore and across Southeast and East Asia. Li Wan is among a generation of artists who have been instrumental in shaping performance art in the region, a generation that includes artists such as Amanda Heng, Chumpon Apisuk, and Seiji Shimoda, among others. So this is one of the most well-known performance works by Li Wan, titled The Journey of a Yellow Man, that he started in 1992 and kept developing for about 10 years. And this photograph is from 1992, the very first performance that he did in London at that year. So in this work, Li Wan covers his body in yellow paint and embodies the persona of this yellow man. And he creates site-specific actions, and he mediates on notions such as alienation, freedom, humility, and spiritual practices. So our team has been excited to work on Li Wan's archive, not only because he's an artist with iconic works, but also he's a foundational arts organizer. So when you look at his archive, you don't necessarily see materials about his own artistic works, but you will see how he documented the local, the regional, and the international art collectives that he was part of, and how he archived the performance art festivals that he co-founded. So you see how creating a community is as important as making artworks in his practice. Sadly, Li Wan passed away this March, and to speak about his work and the communities that he was part of, we invited a series of artists, writers, and art historians who closely worked with him, so they were his friends. And one of these invited guests, Li Wang Choi, who's the second person from the right, that you can see in the photograph. Li Wang Choi talked about the impossibility to tell one story about Li Wan and his art. So he introduced this publication project from 2012, where the invited writers, they chose specific body parts. So one of them chose ears, one of them chose feet, one of them chose the spine, and the other one chose the liver to speak about Li Wan's practice. So they devised a series of interconnecting texts, and they intervened into each other's texts throughout the publication, which is pretty much similar to how body parts in our system would constantly influence each other. And this format hints at how I like to imagine our public programs as well. I'd like you to see them as a series of propositions that accumulate over time in a collaborative, dialogical, and playful format. So they complement, sometimes they complicate, and sometimes they disrupt each other. Form, Color, Action, which was our exhibition on view at the AAA library just until recently, until September, is one of these propositions. This is the entrance of our library, which also works as our exhibition space. So for this exhibition, what we wanted to do was to highlight the Li Wan's sketchbooks and notebooks that were never exhibited before. And then he didn't necessarily see them as artworks, but these were very intimate spaces for him to take notes and to experiment with his ideas. So we were interested in making an argument for the expansion of the practice of archiving performance art, and wanted to propose how to move beyond post-production documentation of performance, such as photographs and videos. So for us, it was crucial to show that Li Wan started his performance work in the early 1990s, but kept experimenting with his ideas from the late 1970s onward. These sketchbooks did not only feature the notes or the instructions about these works, but they presented how his ideas about form, color, movement, and identity matured even before he started using performance art as a medium. Maybe this is an example that I can briefly share with you. The documentation that you see on the left side of the photograph is the documentation of the very first performance in 1992. And the sketchbook that is right next to it is the earliest work that we have in the exhibition, which is from 1978. And you will start seeing how the use of solid color blocks, the volumes and the forms that unfold into each other, and how it relates to the way that he moves his body in his performances. And maybe here I can speak a little bit about how we try to open up this archive for more collaborative and also speculative readings. So we invited, again, a group of artists to co-organize workshops with us. So these were much smaller in size and much more intimate settings as well. And then these are two Polaroids that artist Verena Gefader took during the workshop that she formulated. She basically created this role-playing game where each of us had to embody a particular character. So you could be an architect, you could be a designer, you could be a sci-fi writer, and the goal was to think about how to restage this very particular exhibition. So how to play with these materials in different contexts and different times. And maybe to think about how Li Wan has used alter egos to make certain statements as well, and how collective exercise was something very foundational for his own practice too. And I remember that 3 of the participants, they decided to work together rather than speak individually. One of them was a healer, another one was a time expert, another one was an engineer, and then they proposed to create this time machine to bring Li Wan back to the exhibition, and they imagined how he would give feedback. And this was followed by this act of mourning, I would say, when we moved back to the library, and Verena Gefader, the artist, he wanted us to think about a particular color that we see around us and to somehow abstract it with a humming sound. So I remember doing this very repetitive, quite annoying sound, but it was a collective exercise. We would walk around the library where we would see the works, and this collective act of humming together related to the colors, it was an act of mourning that we performed in a collective way. So this is one of the examples of how we as an organization, we are interested in scholarly research to, around archives, so about how to ground archives themselves, but also in speculative artistic readings of archives, so how to unground what we have in our hands. And maybe I should say that the way that Li Wan uses his body in his performances also triggered a larger series about programs around performance, identity, and gendered bodies. This is a slide of our mini exhibition in the not-for-profit section of Art Basel in Hong Kong last March, where we put a selection of archival materials related to performance art in dialogue with live artworks. As part of the series, theater performer Maya Krishna Rao gave a talk about the movement of the gendered bodies. She introduced her background in Kathakali, a classical dance form where, and I quote her, "We dance with our feet and talk with our hands." So this is a moment when she was speaking about how she performs a male character and how she impersonates a gigantic mountain. And working with Maya Krishna Rao was quite important for our team because she also appears in one of our research collections, Shiba Chachi Archive on Om Swaha. You might be familiar with the series. Om Swaha was a street performance that emerged out of the autonomous women's movement in India in the early 1980s. And it was conceived and performed by a series of women, group of women, who presented real-life experiences around domestic violence over dowry. And in the earlier stages, it was performed by Maya Rao and Anuradha Kapoor in collaboration with a group of feminist activists in Delhi. And activities of the autonomous women's movement were not necessarily considered performance art at that time. But as many artists would suggest and tell us, it had a big impact on the next generation of artists to think about the potential of this particular art form. And this is something that's quite interesting for us as well, because when we say that we want to think about and work about performance art, we are not necessarily interested in fixing the definition of this medium, but trying to think about the movement of the body beyond the visual arts as well. So thinking about street protests, demonstrations, theater, music is as important as thinking about the examples coming the visual arts. Another contribution to this program was from Saring Jung. You also mentioned him, I think you worked with her as well. Saring Jung is a soul-based artist who also works at the intersection of gender, tradition, and political resistance. For us, she presented a work about gukgeuk, which is an all-female musical theater genre that emerged in South Korea right after the end of the Japanese colonial rule. And as part of her long-term research project, she invited Lee Dong-woo, the performer that you see on the left side of the image, and who's also known as the only woman singer to perform in male costumes in traditional music circles of South Korea today. And I'd like to think about these two performances in connection with a music performance that we co-organized with the Department of Cultural Studies of Lingnan University in Hong Kong at the end of last year. For this event, we hosted one performer and one singer who both use performative cross-dressing in the traditional art forms that they practice. The first one is Micha Choi, a Cantonese opera performer who trained herself to perform the male characters on the stage. And the second person was Rutu Jalad, who sang famous songs by Gandharva, a male actor and singer who's known for playing major female roles in the early 20th century Marathi theater. So I'd like to reflect on these programs as part of a comparative project in performance. And maybe this one is a little bit different from the comparative work that we would see in humanities, where often these traditional art forms are somehow sealed and they don't necessarily have this common denominator. And this is how one of our collaborators, Ashish Rajat Yaksa, puts it as well. So with this series, what we wanted to do was to throw on a common crisis related to how modernities, be it a colonial modernity or a socialist modernity, created and imposed clear definitions of what femininity and masculinity are. So what we wanted to explore through these performances was how these forms of resistance through gender-ambiguous performance can speak to each other. And next, what I would like to do is to speak about a thematic series that we recently started developing, and it focuses on art pedagogy. Pedagogy is an obvious research priority and research interest for us because AA is an organization that's devoted to knowledge and also dissemination of knowledge. But we are also involved in art pedagogy as a practice for about 10 years through our learning and participation program, which is our educational programs where we closely work with the secondary school teachers and we offer them resources so that they can change the curriculum that they use for their art classes. And in our research collections, what we do is to look at the historical examples that we have. This image that I have is a screenshot of the website of the Monash University Museum of Art in Melbourne, and they organized this exhibition, Shapes of Knowledge, which was a group exhibition about artistic pedagogy earlier this year. And we were invited as a participant to this group exhibition. So what we chose to do was to work on a display and a series of lectures and workshops that draw on 3 case studies that are related to our research. So these 3 art schools included the Faculty of Fine Arts at the Zhejiang Academy in Hangzhou, the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda, and Bigakko in Tokyo. The very first case study focused on the Zhejiang Academy, an art school that has a tradition of supporting new art since the 1930s. The materials that we exhibited in this exhibition, they came from the personal archive of Zhang Shangtian, a major artist, educator, and writer. And they showed how the school, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, was one of the few places in China where students could access information, have books, and also have teachers who would be able to speak about the developments in art outside of the country. The second case study was about the Faculty of Fine Arts in Baroda, and the materials came from the 4 archives that we hold in our collection. So the archives of K.G. Subramanian, Ghulam Mohammed Sheikh, Jyotiba and Ratan Parimu. And these presented how these influential artist educators not only introduced living traditions into the curriculum, but also how they created archives and how they participated in international networks about the preservation of traditional art forms, and how they initiated art fairs at the school so that students can experiment with the media they could not use in classrooms or studios. And these include culinary arts, theater performances, and puppet making. The last case study was Bigakko, an experimental art school that was active in Tokyo in the early 1970s. And this school was initiated by a publishing house, so it was not an institution, I would say, after the perceived failure of the student movement in 1968. And Bigakko offered an alternative to the fine arts model and future experimental methods and prioritize making art with hands, and also wanted to support a close and intimate relationship between teachers and students, which did not exist at the formal institutions at that time. Here I would like to emphasize that this particular set of materials did not come from the AA research collections, but they came from an artist archive called Yoshiko Shimada. And we invited Yoshiko Shimada in our residency program last year, where we started speaking about how these different archives could actually speak to each other. So it's been an ongoing process for our team. And she's been doing research and gathering these materials about the school for many years. So this is how we wanted to extend an invitation to an artist that we think together and that we work together for this exhibition in Melbourne as well. And maybe more importantly, this is where we also started asking how our research around pedagogy come from a very specific site, pedagogy in art schools, where the teacher is still somehow the master. And for historical reasons in Asia, of course, institutions are important sites, and some of these histories have not been written. So this is what we try to do as part of our larger effort. But how do we look at the role of art educators who work outside of formal institutions? And this question is one of our focuses for the public programs that we recently started for this particular series. So for these programs, we wanted to think about how we interrogate pedagogy and how this resonates with the contemporary practices that challenge institutional settings. And with these programs, we started inviting different types of practitioners who ask these questions to introduce their own vocabularies, their own methods, and the issues around what constitutes a school for them. So earlier this year, as part of our residency program again, Hong Kong-based artist and scholar Zhang Bo organized a series of these silent walking tours where the participants were expected to make drawings of weeds on the street. This would be a tour for about 2 hours. You were definitely not allowed to talk, and we would be just staring at the little beautiful weeds that would grow in a crack in a sidewalk on the street. We also organized, along with Zhang Bo, a traditional tea ceremony where a tea master led a silent tea meditation, which was followed by a conversation about tea as a teacher plant. So this was a way to multiply the frameworks and the methods of pedagogy and also think about gardens, seeds, plants as sites of knowledge. So going a little bit beyond archives, collections, and libraries that we focus maybe too much on sometimes, at least as the Asia Arts Archive team. And to discuss other modalities of alternative education, we hosted Istanbul-based artist and filmmaker Köken Ergun to give a talk about After the Archive, which is an artist-run initiative that he co-founded in 2016, a couple of years ago. And in his talk, Köken Ergun spoke about how his and his artist friends' priorities changed after the Gezi Park protests in Turkey in 2013, and how they needed a space for self-organized learning, especially with a focus on archives and public memory. So this was a time when the major newspapers were under the threat of shutting down by the government, and most of them did not have archives, or had little archives to speak with. So this initiative still organizes talks with people and institutions that build archives and about cultural heritage, about LGBTI communities, as well as about displaced and disappeared people, to state a few. And more recently, it's actually a couple of weeks ago, in October, we hosted Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti in our residency program. Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti, they are architects, artists, and educators who founded Campus in Camps, which is an experimental educational program that is located in Deishe refugee camp in Palestine. For Campus in Camps, Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti, they were interested in what happens when you borrow a permanent institutional model, such as a university, and how you move it to a refugee camp, which is by default a temporary structure. And with the participants who are the residents of the camp, they wanted to think about this particular dilemma: what is permanent and what is temporary in this very particular situation. And they wanted to develop this long-term exercise to create new presentations of refugeehood, going beyond the vocabulary of aid, development, and help. And at the end of the day, I guess for us what matters is that we look at historical and contemporary models together, and we keep thinking about the role of artists in shaping what education means today, and we start with individual stories rather than big official narratives about established institutions. In our conversations with Köken Ergun, Sandy Hilal, and Alessandro Petti, we also discuss how we, as the people who live in Hong Kong, who live in Turkey, who live in Palestine, can learn from each other about our own definitions of identity, resistance, and resilience. So this is just another example of how we keep looking for alternative frames of reference in this region that we call Asia, so that we can become each other's references. And in this effort, public programs become a tool for long-term and collaborative research tool, which might not necessarily have these immediate outcomes, but slowly contribute to a continuous search for affinities and alliances that we want to think about and want to create and foster among cultural stories and cultural practitioners around us. In the interest of time, I believe I have only 5 minutes. I would like to wrap up by speaking about an artwork, The Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia by artist Ho Zunyan, who started developing this multimedia project as part of his residency with AAA around 7 years ago. You might be familiar with the project, but the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia is a database composed of text, music, and online images, and it begins with a seemingly simple question. What is what unites Southeast Asia? And I should add that this is an infinite film. It's an endless stream of video and audio material, as there is an algorithm that keeps grabbing material from the internet. And this is the link if you would like to check the work by yourself. And here you are looking at the 4 screenshots that I took last week from the internet platform of this larger project. And these are from the entry for W for Vertiger, which draws on the common belief that there are some people who have the ability to magically transform themselves into tigers. This is a significant belief that is the reason why there's a group of cultural practitioners in Southeast Asia which connect tigers, ancestral spirits, and shamanistic healing rituals. And as Ho Zunyan says, most of these myths, along with the tigers themselves, they were wiped out during the colonial era. But tigers come back, sometimes through guerrillas, sometimes through bandits, and sometimes even with the Japanese army during the Second World War. And the work brings together these constantly changing associations related to these notions, characters, or motifs that sweep through national borders and perhaps slip through the borders of the academic disciplines too. And I'd like to think this is how we worked at AAA as well, at least we try to do so. So I will end with the image that I started with, the image of Tycho, the supernova. And this time, I will ask you to look at the image just a little bit closer. You will see that there are different colors in the image. Reds and blues, they isolate the materials moving away from Earth from the materials moving towards us. And you will see other colors in this image, including yellow, green, blue-green, orange, and purple. And this color spectrum shows a broad range of different energies and elements and a mixture of directions of motion. I kept this image with me when I was taking notes about the constellations of resources, histories, speculations, and myths that we work on at Asia Art Archive. And it's through these different tools that we are able to keep thinking about what is most visible, what is less visible, what moves towards us and what moves away from us. And it is these tools and the shared sense of curiosity, I would say patience, collaboration, and sometimes vulnerability that makes me excited to work as a curator at AAA. And for me, this is how we become better storytellers for a more generous art history. Thank you so much.
I would like to appreciate all the 4 speakers of these morning sessions, and they all pray as a reference to each other already, I think. And maybe for the Q&A sessions, we can open for the questions from audience first before we get into the final discussion.
I had just a very simple question. A lot of you talk about patronage and it being difficult, the sources, albeit perhaps the partisan nature of it. What are the programs or things that you're doing to encourage patronage in each of your organizations? To everyone.
That literally is the $1 million question. I think it's one, I think, and I mean full disclosure, because I work in an American institution which is almost completely privately funded, and most of our funding is actually not from corporations, it's from private individuals, philanthropic families, and we received, I mean, I won't even say it, it's laughable, the amount I actually receive from state. Basically, you can't pay for like lunch. So things like that. But I think one is, it is a very long-term kind of project to encourage patronage. It really depends on who you are developing as a kind of your network of support. I think the most difficult thing is to transition, and that is the problem with Asia right now. For patronage systems to be sustainable, you have to work at transitioning patrons, donors, sponsors, supporters from a kind of transactional relationship. What is in it for me? Why do I support this show if you're not showing my work, so that my work increases in value? And I think that is where a lot of the Asian scenes shoot themselves in the foot, because it means several things. It means you could never cluster, you could never actualize a cluster or a network of similar-minded individuals to come together, you know, at the point when it is most critical to realize a project. Because if it's transitional, it becomes kind of like, you're my friend, but you're my competitor, you know, and the institution is or the curator is a kind of negotiating chip. I think the most difficult, really, I think everybody needs to work in their respective scenes, and it's so specific. You know, there is no magic formula. It depends on Singapore is very, very different, you know, but like India, there is a lot of money. There's a lot of money. What is needed for the arts is, you know, in Singapore, we talk about, you know, once the Minister of Culture said, actually, my big achievement as Minister of Culture is if I can get the budget for culture to 1%, like 1% is enough to feed, you know, to do a lot of different. So that scaling is important, but I think the most important is everyone needs, that's why I think it needs a collaboration of people among the scene, because patronage cannot be developed. It's different from America, which has gone through that process. It cannot be developed in isolation. So all the players need to somehow come together. I'm not sure in India who is the right platform to say we are going to do something to grow, you know, support for, you know, Indian or South Asian art, so that you are not you are resisting a kind of atomization. But I think really the key is to move beyond a transitional. And the example I always give is, oddly enough, actually the Chinese have learned that really fast. Yeah, I don't think I think the Indian scene is still trying to figure that out. But the reason why, and there's a reason why there are specific collectors or supporters from specific scenes across Asia that are sitting in the boards of the major, or the committees of the major US museums. I mean, really, nobody's showing their work, but why are they there? So there is that kind of conceptual leap, I think, has to be made, but I think it needs a kind of collaborative approach among people of the scene. It cannot be done by any one institution, because then you are perpetuating this atomization. This is, you are mine, you know, you support me, not them. We can't share, you know. But I think that really just gets you into the serpent chasing its own tail constantly. You will never ever get out. Somehow somebody must break that cycle. Yeah? And really, you know, the US is different. You must remember that legally there is only one state museum, which is the Smithsonian Institution. Everything else, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, is nothing but a collection of private collections. That's literally how the museum was built. People need to remember that. You know, that is what, you know, private philanthropy gets you ultimately.
Shall I try? I guess patronage is also quite a remarkable question that we have as part of the team, but we have a specific team of development that think about that particular question, and they regularly organize meetings with researchers, meeting with artists. Sometimes they do international trips together. So there's this constant engagement. It's not only one time we have an annual fundraiser and please come and support our work. It's mostly about the continuous engagement with the patrons. And I think it's something that's very much needed as well, because our users are very, very specific. It's not the general audience that we're speaking about. Our users or audiences are primarily artists, researchers, and educators. So it's a very niche situation. And I would say that a remarkable percentage of our annual budget, it comes from our annual fundraiser that just took place last Saturday. And for me, it's an amazing moment to realize that there's a group of artists and galleries who are willing to donate artworks, and the 100% of the sales would come back to Asia Arts Archive. So this is a tremendous generosity that we also rely on. So I would say this is a combination of two things in that sense.
Just to go back, I think personally I'd use the word financial sustainability as opposed to patronage, and I think I would like to kind of just highlight that, because I don't know if patronage is the answer or can be the only way of going about it. And I think actually if we look at our patrons, our biggest patrons at Khoj have been the artists themselves, who have at some point of time, continuously come to Khoj, got something from it, and have then given back in terms of work that they've donated, which have gone towards auctions, which have actually helped us raise money to buy the building that we have, to like giving us works for unique limited edition portfolios that we've sold. But I think that was a model that was still viable maybe about 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. But at the current moment, with the number of foundations, the number of biennales and large format exhibitions that have come up, I don't think the patron pool has opened up that much. So I don't know. Yes and no, but the thing is that it becomes difficult for a place like Khoj, which is not able to what Muni was saying, that it's not very easily able to identify this is what we're doing. The money that you give us will get you this. That kind of very tangible result is very hard to give because it's so process oriented. We only do one exhibition in a year. So I think, which is not to say that it can't happen, I think we're also going through a kind of reflection to reorganize and re-articulate how we define the work we do, and therefore how you sell the upside, I think.
I think your question is quite essential, but I think my answer will be not very exciting, because Guangdong Museum is in the National University. So we have a lot of limitation of the fiscal system. So we have a half budget from university, but the other part from the National Foundation or Cultural Ministry. And but how we could enlarge the possibility of the project? My strategy is to discuss with artists and the curators with long-term project, because with the time we could prepare better the material and the financial. Yeah. So yeah, not very exciting. And another one is sometimes when we make the exhibition, some artists are very kind to have the donation of the artwork. So we have a small professional collection, but because we are national, so we cannot sell the works. Yeah. So it's a bigger problem for us. Yeah. Thank you.
I forgot to say, I think the other big challenge in this area is, and it's very difficult to have a kind of uniform answer to this, is that the big challenge, I think, to the arts in this area is that the profile of support is changing very rapidly as generational change comes. And you see this forever. For example, like in the US, you see this with what has happened to the opera houses and symphonic orchestras. And you know, you want to lose money, run an opera company. It is the most expensive art form. Western opera is the most expensive and the most, like, really, you throw $1 million at it, the next production, one show, it's over. In fact, it's not enough. It's just the reality, and there are very reasons for that. But I think, for example, with these, the idea of being funded by subscriptions, people that will buy whole seasons, is over. And why is the reason over? It's because the new generation of arts goers do not like to be committed for a whole year or 6 months to X number of productions. That's just one expression. But I think we all have to be very careful, because it's not very clear what is the change, and it's very specific to localities, where the new kind of how patronage systems are changing. So even foundations that used to be founded by, for example, old philanthropic families, as the younger generation takes over, what do? They professionalize fund giving. So they suddenly appoint an MBA who's looking at all your KPIs. And you know, when you say, oh, it's very difficult to describe our benefit, they're like, but can you fill in this form? So that this generational change of having professional business MBA graduates coming in to operationalize, for example, foundation grant giving. And those of us in Asia, we know for some of the big regional international projects, we depend on Western foundations, right? Everybody will say yes. But there is a kind of change coming, so I think everybody needs to seriously study that and how it affects them, because it will affect you at various kinds of levels. Basically, this idea that traditional sources of support are changing.
Okay, thanks. I think before the lunch, we still can open the last questions.
So I think taking off Wanshli's question, two questions really. One is, for all of you, what proportion of your funds come from individual donors, and what proportion come from, just roughly even, from institutions? And the reason I'm asking that is also because we keep reading in the news that ours is probably the first generation, so the people in their 20s are probably the first generation who are going to be less well off than their parents, especially in America. This seems to have taken hold. So could you talk a little bit about that, and if that is changing how you're approaching sort of fundraising from individuals and that sort of thing? Yes.
Can I just add, because it's somehow connected, so you can answer?
Yeah. The money is everyone's future. Notice.
Because before then we discussed about patronage, and I'm interested to expand to the idea of power. And since, like mentioned by Gita also yesterday, that for almost 20 years we talk about the global and the local, and we always refer global also as part of like the power of the West, and we always somehow create the tensions of the power relationship between the West and the rest of the world. So in your practice, from those four very interesting presentations, like working within the context of within Asia itself, like maybe a bit different from when we work within the context Asia and the West. How do you see the changing of the power? For example, in my case, working in the Jogja Biennale for almost 10 years with the Equator area, it really changed the idea of the funding system, because now we are facing the situation that we work also with all the countries that they have their own limitation in the funding system. Because, like, for example, with India or with Brazil or with Nigeria, it was very difficult for us to find the local funding to collaborate with us. And at the same time, we could not ask funding from Buddha Institute or Buddhist
fund this kind of project in Asia. So it really changed the way we see collaborations, and somehow then also changed like the power relationship between like all the collaborating countries. So I would like to ask about this, and maybe in the case of Asia Art Archive, do you think also like because you have more funding than maybe other archive organizations in Asia, and then you have more fund to acquire archive from like established artists all across the region, do you think that people see you as more powerful, your organization more powerful than others? Because, for example, if we discuss some artists, why they don't donate their archive into the local organization, and do you think that sometimes you have to face this kind of problematic situation where the archive in the end up in Hong Kong instead of in their hometown, something like that? How do you see this in terms of the power relationship?
Shall I start? Very good question, thank you. In terms of the power relationships, I would say that if we start thinking about the archives themselves, I think it's very important for us that we don't actually acquire the archives, the physical, the original material, but we only digitize them. And we don't also have the copyright to this archive. So really when it comes to acquisition to our collection, we are speaking about the digitization and making it accessible on the website. So still some of these artists who are interested in sharing their archive with the larger public, we can digitize them and then they can also express themselves. So I wouldn't say that we are in a position to say so much about the future of an archive per se. And it's also one of the reasons why we were saying, I was trying to say that we are not really interested in extracting these archives from where they are, but trying to think about access rather. In terms of the finances, financial resources that AAA would receive compared to the other archive-driven organizations, I think it's a very fair criticism, and we are very much aware of that as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why we also put extra effort in organizing workshops, for instance. The most recent one was in April, which was an organizational archive, institutional archives organization workshop, where we invited and also supported some of the participants coming from different parts of Asia. They were keynote speakers, it was a closed-door workshop, so we realized that we are in a privileged position, and we want to use that privilege to share the resources that we have. So these are some of the methods that we try to think about when it comes to power structures and where we sit in this particular framework.
I don't think the power question per se also stays with Coach, only because again we don't have any collections at all. Even though we support every artist who comes to our residency, their travel, lodging, per diems and production budgets, even though they're small, are all taken care of by us, and we work really hard to fundraise towards them. But the copyright and the ownership of the creative, the IP as well as the physical works lies squarely with the artists, and we physically don't keep anything either. So in that sense, it was built into the institutional mandate to not ever have that position where it can exude a certain kind of power. Regarding the funding part, I think you're absolutely right. I don't per se have a solution for it. I think over the years, and because we have 22 years of living on the goodwill, patronage and funding, largely which has come from core funds, which have largely been Eurocentric, whether it was HEBOS or the Norwegian Embassy or Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller. We've completely depended on that. And I think over the years, there is an art of proposal writing that you develop, where you get to kind of play it up to what success indicators are demanded of you about proving how this project is going to change the world. But at the same time, you also get to do what you want to do. And I think that's a very fine balance to maintain. But I think the reality as it is now is that that is the thing that you have to do. And there are, I think, more generous donors and kinder donors and then there are not so kind ones, and you have to discern that. But I think what we started doing long term is trying to see what are the other kinds of financial models that can exist that help bring another kind of sustainability. I think the big step that happened for us was that with the Christie's auction, that we were able to raise enough money that we own the building, and I think that's a big security. So the fact that you own the physical infrastructure that you have already gives you a lot more autonomy and sustainability. And increasingly we have also started doing some kind of rental programs, small time consultancies, and other kinds of ways in which we can ensure that what is the core programming that for which Khoj exists can continue outside. And we've also taken a lot of time to build a corpus so that the interest of the corpus can also help run the basics of the organization.
Okay, I share the case of the discordant harmony because this project supported by Goethe Institute, but I think Goethe Institute take a charge around like a little bit more than half of the budget, of the total budget. But the best thing is this budget could guarantee for 3 years. And we know for the Northeast Asia, the fiscal system, the governmental fiscal system is quite strict. So we check every case every year. So how we could plan a continuous project for 3 years? I think because we have one budget from Europe for 3 years, and every venue we have the local budget and from the different institutions. So we have the space, we have the possibility to arrange that like a production fee or per diem or something with this difference. So to create a kind of flexibility. So like discordant harmony, this kind of a project, it's very difficult only for example, Japan, China, Taiwan, and Korea. If only four curators from here, and depending the institution, the regional institution, and collaborating together, it's very difficult to make a 3 years project.
To answer your question first, the largest proportion is private individuals. It's about half to 2/3 of it, then followed by foundations and corporations, much less. And also we don't have so many corporations because corporate giving has a different kind of structure, because especially if it's coming from marketing departments, it has a different kind of structure, and you need to negotiate that differently. Whereas, you know, it depends on the institution. I mean, the program that we have, sometimes it's very difficult to fit exactly into that kind of track. Whereas individuals, that you find individuals who share the same passions you share. And I would say, I think somebody was mentioning, so what does that mean? I would say one of the things with cultivating individual support is to make it not about support, but to make it a kind of collaborative, that the patron is on that journey with you because they are also learning something that only you can give them. I know that's very difficult in some circumstances in Singapore. It limited, there's increasingly a pool of money. Of course, of people like that. In New York, of course, it's much more kind of developed. On the issue of sustainability, I was going to, our colleague from Khoj said the right thing. I would say, if you want sustainability, one is small organizations with actually more modest budgets. They feel less of the pressure of this unequal power relations than big organizations whose budgets have to be very big. So when your budget is very big, you will find that you are competing at the top with only a few the pool of sponsors shrinks dramatically in any city. So there's a decision that has to be made, because I know in art everybody wants to be bigger, but you know, with regard to funding, you must realize that when you move up, the pool becomes very small, and that pool gets more powerful. That means they make more demands on you. So it's a kind of trade-off. You have to decide where along that scale you are comfortable or you feel able to negotiate. The second thing is, like, I think my suggestion when I'm asked, I said my suggestion for if you have to fundraise for anything, fundraise for your overheads. Get somebody to give you a building, not lease. Get a building, you know. Get an endowment to support your salaries. Programming is much easier to raise money for, and you can scale programming. You're not going to fire your staff every year, because that thing goes up and down. It's no good for an organization. So I think the most important is, if you can, you know, find your sugar daddies and sugar mummies to get you a building, donate you a building. If they are a property developer, can they just give you one, you know, of their many sort of properties? Try and get an endowment to support your core staff, to pay at least most of the salary of your core staff. Name the director after them, you know, after their grandmother, their grandfather, whoever. Name your curator, okay? The curator has no choice. He or she is just the so-and-so curator, no choice, okay? Whoever it is, that's the one thing I would say. If you're the director or the CEO, you must be very dictatorial about it. In the developing world in Asia, that helps you a lot, because again, I keep saying, you can do one less talk, you can lengthen your exhibitions. You can't go and find another space. You cannot be hiring and firing staff over the years. It's just completely sort of is an impossible situation. So I would say do that. You know, don't just campaign for programs and exhibitions, because the money is spent very easily. One show and it's all gone. Then you start again. But if you have some funding for your salaries, you have the building or the office down pat, you know, you can continue. Okay. That's quite satisfying.
My question is primarily for us. A lot of curatorial work is incidental, and it's also contingent to who you meet, where your funding comes from. A lot of other factors are playing into it. For instance, who is willing to share an archive and who isn't. And are there strategies within curatorial work to foreground how it is all, to an extent, incidental, so that we don't fall into the trap of institutionalization of, say, bureaucratic processes that we have inherited to extent?
Do you want to start? Oh, it's me. I think thank you so much for the question. I think one of the reasons why we try to spread our programs throughout the year, this is precisely the reason why we've been trying to think about that format, because we could also, for instance, every couple of years we also organize this large-scale symposium. The latest one was about art periodicals last year in January. So there are different formats that we keep thinking about. For that type of larger scale events, we have to plan ahead. We have to secure our funding, we have to secure our collaborators far in advance, and it's a very particular way of thinking about programs. But when it comes to the examples that I was giving about the walking tours, about the more speculative type of readings of these archives or engaging the users themselves, these are sometimes very sporadic, I would say. Sometimes they just happen only 1 month before the event takes place. And I guess this is a privilege that we have, you know, having that flexibility. We try to plan for an entire year, you know, under this framework, or let's say thematic umbrella, when we say either performance art or pedagogy, but sometimes these are incidental, as you are saying. When we were organizing the performing gender event with Micha Choi and Rutu Jalat, the singer and the Cantonese opera performer and then the singer, we were not necessarily thinking that Maya Krishna Rao would join us, for instance, next March. And it's quite amazing to think about them today because I'm able to make those connections. And it's something that I hope that our users, our audiences share as well. But again, it would be very Hong Kong specific in that sense. Otherwise, it's only images that I would be able to share with you. But I really hope that this is what we are able to do in Hong Kong.
So I think
this question is to Bosque, and this is a response to what you showed on archiving ephemeral performances. So when it comes to public art interventions, as a researcher, a lot of times it's really frustrating to find a acute time documentation. But however, often there are members and the participants, members of the audience who end up recording snippets that might never see the light of day in an academic context, which might be invaluable to a future researcher. So within the model of institutional archives, can there ever be a space for a citizen archive? Or is it too blasphemous?
Wow, great question. I'll try my best. I'm thinking about an example. For instance, the Autonomous Women's Movement. It's an archive that we cannot acquire in its entirety. First of all, the practitioners, the activists, the people, the individuals who were part of the movement, they would say that you cannot archive an entire movement, right? You can also only have fragments. So when we started our conversation with one of these practitioners, she was there, she was documenting some of these, I wouldn't say performance, but let's say street actions. And perhaps she didn't necessarily have the idea of exhibiting them or depositing them, the digital versions of these images in an archive. But I guess it's really about how we formulate these questions. Also, it's not an art archive, right? So all of these very variables we've been very much aware of, and we try to build our conversation saying that how would it make sense if we put that fragment next to an archive of Li Wan, for instance. So in that sense, we are trying to ask these questions. And I'm thinking about the citizen archive part, how I can respond to it in an intelligent way. Maybe we can continue this conversation later, and then we can also speak with our researchers from the India team, because it was a particular example that then they dealt with. So maybe we can take it outside if that's fine with you.
I just have one comment on this thing about archive. I think curatorially, as archives start being built in Asia, I think when curators use archives, especially in Asia, and given that the AAA in particular is somewhat different because it's at a certain hierarchy, the question to ask is not what is there, is what is not there. I think it's very, very important when I get very worried when I read curatorial proposals and texts that say they went into this archive, but I can't get a sense of what has been elided or what is silent, and that's very, very problematic, especially if you're dealing with artists who are still alive. So that's very important, and that is also a main challenge with performance art in particular, because it's durational. And my comment and full disclosure on the Li Wan, when I was in Singapore, I organized the first and it's still the only institutional survey of Li Wan's work, so I know the material reasonably kind of well. Even based on the selection, I think you also have to be aware of who are the people that speak for the artists in the archive and the programs of the archive. I don't want to use the word clique, but invariably there is a group, and the group keeps appearing. But usually artists' networks are wider than that group that appears. So, any sort of, usually when young curators come to me, I always ask them, generate the list, who is the acknowledged people that are always around speaking for the artists that participate in public programs in New York, in Delhi, in wherever, and who else is there when you look at if there's a catalogue raison. When you look at the catalogue raison and you look at the bibliography, who else is there that has, in a sense, critical commentary on the artist that does not appear in these repeating cliques of acknowledged expert commentators? I think that's where I think archives are very useful in not what they have, but in revealing the gaps, the elisions, and the omissions in them. And I think the most interesting exhibitions using archives takes that into account, what is actually missing.
Congratulations on the funding. It's very